Okay, I'm going to begin. And Tia, there may be a problem with your microphone. We're not getting any real sound from it. So if
I think there might be, yeah.
Oh, I hear your voice now.
Oh, okay, great.
Tia, would you just tell me a little bit about yourself and why you signed up for this program?
Sure. My name's Tia Cole. I'm from Lynn, and in the last maybe 26, 30 months, I've been a founding member of 3 different nonprofits.
Wow.
And all of us like kind of get together, but nobody really knows what they're doing. And I don't know, this is just something that I've been looking at ever since it was announced to try and see if maybe I can find my way better and make that learning curve a little shorter, and maybe see some other organizations that match my priorities as they grow.
Nice. Okay. We may have other people jump onto this call, but I'm guessing that a lot of people are waiting to just receive the deck and possibly sign on to listen to the recording. So feel free to interrupt me at any time, ask any questions that you like. We'll make this as personalized to your needs as possible. And let's just see where we go, okay?
Oh, awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Oh, it's at the very end. I'm sorry. Okay, so the idea here is that we're going to talk about how to maximize board experience. And by that, I mean, yesterday I had a session that was much more about the basics of board individual member responsibilities, obligations, what to expect from a board service. This particular presentation is premised on the understanding that people coming to this already have board experience, have experiences to share, but would like to improve upon that experience for future, with future organizations. So my goal today is to share some characteristics about what makes for an outstanding board, be able to hear about your own experience, and then hopefully help you be in a place to make a commitment for your own, what you would like to bring to the next board that you are a part of. So the critical question to be thinking about as we explore the topic of board service is, why should I be giving my time, my skills, my networks, my treasure of financial resources and so forth to this particular organization as a board member? So board service does bring a number of benefits, and it's important to be thinking about those when the whole range of benefits, when we think about what organization would be a good match for where I would like to give back. So for example, you will be giving your time and expertise to an organization you care deeply about. You'll be part of making sure that that organization remains strong and viable and serves the community well. You will be in a leadership role and become part of the organization's success alongside the staff and the executive director. As a board member, it's a different role than being another type of volunteer or being a donor. It's really getting on the inside, getting under the hood and learning how a nonprofit functions and what does it take for an organization to actually create value for the community. So if you're interested in board service, hopefully the idea of getting under the hood is something that attracts you and excites you. There's also a personal element to being part of a board, which is about getting to know the other board members, getting to know the organization's ED and staff. And this can be really important for people who are looking to just grow their personal and professional networks. And of course, it's important to note that most boards will expect that you make their organization a priority in your annual giving. But again, you can be a donor to an organization you care about, even an important donor, a major donor, and not be on a board, right? Board service is going in additional, taking on additional roles and responsibilities. However, annual giving is still an important part of what you're bringing to that organization. So things to consider as you approach organizations and think about becoming part of their board would be, how passionate am I about their work? Am I willing to really be active in my participation, not only at the full board level, but also in committee meetings? Am I able to think beyond my own personal interests and consider the impact that the organization is having on those that it serves? And am I willing and able to be an ambassador for this organization with my own personal and professional networks and beyond, out in the community? Should the organization ask me, for example, to be a part of how it raises money and has me speaking with donors, has me speaking with prospective funders, am I willing and able to take on those roles? So what characterizes the best boards, and what am I going to be looking for as I interview and think about organizations that I might like to be part of? Well, the best boards have an open and constructive partnership with the executive director. They take time to deliberate issues and hear all sides before making key decisions. They serve as a brain trust, not a rubber stamp. And this, of course, is connected to the previous item about decision making. If decisions are brought to the board where they're basically already baked and the expectation is that with very little conversation or discussion, the board will sign off on a decision, then essentially it's not serving its function as a brain trust for that organization. The board is responsible to make sure that the organization has qualified leadership that is regularly reviewed and evaluated. Typically, this is the executive director role. Some boards also play a role in selecting other senior staff, but that's through an agreement reached with the executive director. But the most essential function is in selecting, hiring, reviewing, evaluating the executive leadership of the organization. The most productive boards have engaged members who show up in a very, in a more than just physical way, who show up intellectually, who show up prepared, who show up informed, and who take time to be engaged. It's important for boards to be thinking strategically, staying focused on their mission, staying in touch with the community, and ensure that everyone at the table has a voice. A lot of boards, unfortunately, do fall short of some of these important characteristics. Here are some of the ways, here are some of the pitfalls that they may fall into. Too much information and too little time. There can be a tendency, particularly on the part of staff, to provide a lot of information to board members, but without having the opportunity to really engage with the content. So if board meetings are consumed with a lot of reports and not a lot of opportunity to engage with the content, it can lead to a sense of being overwhelmed, or that the meeting time is all listening and not enough actual conversation. The issue of what kind of relationship takes place with the executive director. In some cases, there can actually be tension with the executive director, and in other cases, the organization may be extremely close to the executive director, essentially populated with friends of the executive director, which doesn't allow for enough autonomy and independence. Boards can fall into a trap of micromanagement, of being too hands-on, which is actually something that frequently leads to tension with the ED, but they can also be very laissez-faire, too hands-off, in which case they're not fulfilling their responsibilities of setting organizational direction and driving critical decisions that affect the organization's future. Lack of board member engagement, lack of accountability, a very short-term focus, which is one of those looking at the trees and losing sight of the forest, and essentially having meetings that don't feel meaningful, which leads board members to wonder, why am I here? This graph is a way of trying to capture that very complex board and ED relationship, and many organizations are going to move around in these quadrants based on how long board members have been there, how long the executive director has been there, where the organization is in its developmental stage. But the goal for boards and EDs is to work together over here in quadrant 3 in what we call a constructive partnership. Some of the things you might hear from executive directors about what causes tension with boards is on this list, right? Board members are not staying in their lane, or they're not engaged. They're missing strategic opportunities. They come up with ideas and expect staff to implement, and staff feel judged rather than supported by board members. Meanwhile, board members might say, we're being updated, but we're not being engaged. Or even worse, we're not being updated. We're being told that decisions have been made after the fact and we feel left out. Most people at a board level do not appreciate surprises. And having an agreement for no surprises can be one of the most important agreements to nail down between a board and executive director. A lot of times the lack of trust between a board and an executive director means that the executive director is reluctant to bring bad news or uncomfortable news to the board. The ED may feel that he or she wants to work it out on their own and bring the information to the board when it's been resolved. This actually can be a way of undermining trust between the board and ED if the board doesn't feel that they've had an opportunity to know what's happening and to be engaged and to lend their expertise and support to resolve important difficult situations. And of course, if only the strong voices dominate around the table, many people's talents are going untapped. So these are ways that boards function at less than optimal way. But what are some ways that the tensions can be minimized? It's actually not that complicated. A very clear set of expectations for board members, which involves things such as how many meetings am I expected to show up to in person? Is it all of them? Is it some of them? How many committee assignments am I expected to have? What's the giving level that's expected? Just clarifying as much as possible what the prevailing culture is in this particular board and what is expected of members is a very important way to start from a strong level playing field. Creating opportunities for board members to engage around the real and substantive issues so that board members are not tempted as a way of being involved to get distracted by what might be considered micromanagement issues. Obviously, communication, as in every human endeavor, communication is really the heart of how we minimize tensions in any kind of a group setting. A careful review of the committee structure. There are organizations that, particularly ones that have been around for a while, that may have a little bit too heavy of a committee structure for the number of people that they have, or where the committees themselves don't feel clear about what their functions are and what their contributions are. So every once in a while, taking the opportunity to review what the committee structure is and reconsider whether it continues to make sense is a very helpful practice. Basic and good meeting practices where meetings are well facilitated and people's voices are brought into the room is always helpful and will lead to engaged members who feel wanted and appreciated. When we get engaged members around the table who feel wanted, who feel appreciated, who feel that there's a purpose for their being there, you get a better and more productive board as a result. In terms of speaking about roles, in general, and you may know this from your previous experience, staff and EDs do not need board members to get engaged at the level of what they might consider to be micromanagement. And EDs in particular are very sensitive to board members being in touch with staff without engaging them, putting things on a staff person's work plan without clearing that with the executive director, taking up time at board meetings without having a real purpose and intention in mind. But they do need and value a board for a very large number of reasons. most importantly, the board as a brain trust is providing that critical big picture thinking and is governing at that level around annual and multi-year goals. Board members who engage on the strategic issues and help to provide input to the ED so that there is a team at the heart of leading the organization is one of the best ways for an organization to function. Of course, it's important that the board take time to evaluate the executive director and ensure that the organization has a strong financial footing. Staff and EDs need boards that will help them pay attention to leadership succession, particularly at the staff level, but also at the board level. The board itself is responsible for its own success. The board is responsible for building a pipeline of who's coming to the table and thinking about how are we going to replenish the talent and skills around this table as people cycle off. And of course, the board is a big, important part of how the organization stays connected to the community. So before I go on to talk a little bit about committee structures, why don't I pause here and see if any questions have come up for you, Tia, or if you have any feedback on what's been presented so far.
No, it's all really interesting and new. Every board or organization that I work with doesn't have an executive director because we can't afford one yet.
Yeah.
So every board that I have is like a group of volunteers, you know, and everyone runs the operations, pretty much everyone runs, you know, like, so it's really interesting to know how it's all supposed to work.
Well, you know, rather than feeling that this is like a bar that you're supposed to be meeting and you aren't, I think it might be more helpful to think about the stage of development of the organizations that you're involved with, because it's very typical for startup organizations to be in the exact place that you mentioned. And but what you may find as time goes on and as your organization solidify is that it's a challenge for board members to transition into new roles. So assuming that you get your organizations to a place where you're able to actually hire staff, you're already starting to shift the balance between who reports to whom and how does work get done, right? And over time, you may find that the kind of people who are around the table will need to evolve as well, because as the organization sort of builds its own muscles and can take on more of the function of running the organization programs and services, the board members need to shift into another role. Some board members can do that. Some of your existing board members may easily make that transition, and others may feel that the type of contribution that they're best able to make was now at the startup phase and it's time for somebody else to step up, right? So just be able to look at that arc of how organizations develop and think of this as a place you'll be heading to, not something that you should be at right this moment.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think with my oldest one, the makerspace, that's kind of what's happened. It's the board was all operations as well, and we've sort of kind of split. So like my role on that was really hands-on for a long time, and now that I think about it, it's really hands-off, and I'm really just an advocate and that kind of thing with it. So that makes sense.
Good. Okay. So thanks for that. That's very important, and I appreciate that you raised the issue of you know, organizations are at different stages, and so this presentation is making assumptions that I probably didn't clarify up front, and the organizations that you're talking about are just as important and just as valid as ones that have evolved to a later stage. So assuming that you have moved on to the point of having standing committees in a typical governance structure, the most common ones are finance committee, governance committee, programs or services committee that might end up being subdivided based on the type of work that's offered or created, the type of product that's created by the organization. Fundraising and resource development is another typical standing committee. I also should have on this list executive committee. Most organizations, many of them, let's say, have executive committees, which are typically composed of the officers. And the role of that executive committee is something that also needs attention, because it typically can be sort of the group that the executive director tends to lean on the most, or tap when something is needed on a very quick turnaround basis. And it's important for the executive committee to know how to engage the rest of the board, so that the other board members not on the executive committee continue to feel involved and part of important decision making as appropriate. But then in addition to having these standing committees, there's a number of different situations, such as strategic planning, audit, capital campaign, special projects that might require ad hoc committees or temporary committees or task forces, these could be called, rather than committees, where people come together around a very specific event. It could be a special fundraising event, it could be a campaign, something with a limited lifespan. And part of the reason I raise this about committees is that if the committee structure isn't reviewed regularly, sometimes these committee structures can stay on the books and kind of atrophy, and people can get assigned to them but not know why they're there or what the purpose is of the committee. So it's helpful to just review, what that committee structure is. The best and most productive committees are likely to have outside advisors who are not full board members and can be part of creating a pipeline to future board membership. Have a committee charter, in other words, a purpose. Everyone knows why these committees exist. They know what the goals are for the year. They have a staff person in the ideal world that is their liaison into the organization and that engages with them closely. They provide meaningful and timely reports to the full board. These reports, rather than being sort of the minutes of their meetings, can be focused on what are some of the issues that we are celebrating and excited about, what are some of the issues that we are concerned about, and where do we need the rest of the board to help us to make decisions. And to the degree that committees are doing the real work by continuing to engage the rest of the board members so that board members feel connected to the picture of the whole, rather than having a lot of disparate committees working out in little silos where people start to lose track of what the whole looks like. That helps with creating a sense of purpose and cohesion at the level of the full board. So what happens in the boardroom is really the heart of the matter. And what we want to avoid is any of the items on this list where board members feel confused, or that there's a lack of trust in the room, or they're overwhelmed by the amount of material presented, or they feel excluded, because their engagement will decline and that will impact the productivity of the full board. So as you approach boards and start thinking about organizations that you'd like to engage with, it's very common, of course, to connect first around the mission of that organization. But remember that as a board member, your engagement is happening in a boardroom with other board members and is essentially looking under the hood. So what you want to know is what happens at a typical board meeting. And you might be able to provide some answers to some of these questions based on your past experience, right? Like in other boards that you've been part of, who did most of the speaking? How were disagreements handled? How were decisions made? What about the basics? Does everyone in the group really know each other? Do they know each other's names? What happens when someone doesn't understand an item or needs clarification? What's the response like in a typical board meeting? Are people in the group clear about the purpose of the meeting? Tia, I don't know if you have any comments here based on the board you're part of.
I think for like, I have like an older, middle, and new organization. My middle organization, our last board meeting was 5.5 hours, and it was exhausting. And I feel like a lot of this could have been handled better. I'm looking at these going, oh wow, all right, I see how these questions specifically can relate to that 5-hour board meeting. Like, there was a lot of people making decisions, but not all the people. But you know what I mean? It was a lot.
Yeah, and as a change advocate yourself, you know, it's very, you have a role, a very important role to play in helping to ask some of these questions. And at the same time, I would say it's very helpful to have an ally if you're really going to be able to move forward with making change happen, because culture is a very complex and difficult thing to change. And boards, like any other group, develop a culture, develop a set of practices and norms, and tend to default to those behaviors. So changing, you know, making people aware of the behaviors is step one, and then trying to make change happen. And it can happen. A lot of very positive change can happen, but the more people who are allied with you in creating new practices, the more likely your success will be. Does that make sense?
Sorry, I've been trying to keep myself muted. Yeah, it does. I'm like taking a screenshot and sending it to my board chat.
You'll be getting this presentation, and you should feel free to share it with as many people as you would like. So
that would be great. Thank you.
Public property for everybody. Yeah. So again, going off the assumption that you are looking to engage with a new board, one thing you might look at are what happens in a board meeting, right? What do the agendas look like? What do the minutes look like? If you can ask to see agendas and minutes, you could take a look at what was discussed, how much time was devoted to reports versus discussion. In the case you mentioned of a 5-hour board meeting, you know, what kind of decision-making techniques, if any, were used to try to help bring the board to a consensus? Does the board use a consent agenda? And a consent agenda is typically something that might be used by a somewhat more mature organization that is having regular minutes and committee reports as part of its standing agenda. When minutes and committee reports that don't need further discussion can be bundled into a package and accepted by the board in one vote at the beginning of a meeting, it can help free up time at a board meeting for people to focus on the most important issues. Here are some specifics that you might look for in board agendas that help you know that this organization has really got its act together, right? So the ideal board agenda is simple, it's focused. If there's a consent agenda, that helps to open space and time. Number 3 here is probably one of the most important, which is that the most important items on any agenda should be put first. Couple of reasons for that. One is when people arrive at a meeting, they're a little bit more fresh. It's very frustrating for people to have already been sitting at a table for 2 hours and be thinking about when they're finally going to get to go home, only to find that the most important issue of the night was brought out for their consideration 5 minutes before the end of the meeting. And unfortunately, that happens a lot, particularly when boards operate out of a standing agenda that tends to load up time with report outs, committee reports, looking at our last meeting minutes and so forth. That eats up time that could be better spent looking at the important issues. So putting important issues first on the agenda, putting questions into the agenda that say, here's what we're going to be talking about, here's the question we have for board members. Making sure that people have enough time to really engage and discuss those most important issues. And again, for organizations that have both a board and staff, it can be very helpful for the boards and for their functioning to regularly use executive session. By that I mean a session at which only the board members and not staff are at the table. Many boards use executive session, but they only use it when they have something negative to say about the executive director, or they're considering questions of compensation or the executive director's evaluation. And what happens is that when executive session is only called for those things, the board has very rare opportunities to just speak to other board members without the presence of staff, which does change the dynamic in the room right away. And the executive director is always feeling uncomfortable when executive session takes place, because the executive director knows that he or she is being discussed in some way in the room. So if executive session can be used regularly, just as a matter of practice, like every other meeting we build in 15 minutes for executive session, it's really just a way to take the temperature of the board members. How are people feeling? What are some things that we haven't talked about recently that we'd like to see on future agendas? Anything like that. And it starts to create more trust in the boardroom, while also helping the executive director to know that board members have things to talk about that don't necessarily include any kind of critique of the executive director. It's very important when executive session does take place that there be some sort of verbal report out, usually by the chair, to the ED, so that the ED continues to feel included and doesn't have to be concerned or worried about what was discussed when I wasn't in the room. But as a regular tool, it can actually be very helpful at building trust and confidence among board members. This slide really talks about some of the basics of sort of any successful team, which when we translate into a board session, into a board context, having full participation by all members that's managed by a strong and effective board chair will help people to contribute equally at the table. Regular interaction among board members, both informally and formally, is part of building a sense of membership, that people communicate regularly with one another, get to know one another, and can better understand others' perspectives or emotions or passions when those surface in a board meeting. And of course, board meetings that have basic good meeting facilitation practices will help avoid the type of scenario where a board meeting basically has no clear agenda, or it can go on for an extreme length of time that doesn't feel productive for the members who are there. So you can ask, a prospective organization, how have you built community? Some ideas for building community can be name cards, a board mentor system for new people, having food at board meetings. Food always helps with interaction. Staff that provide help around transportation, childcare, technology. A guide to commonly used acronyms is an incredibly simple and yet very effective way at building community. When someone new comes to the board table and can't keep up with conversation because everyone uses very common acronyms but has not taken the time to explain what those are, it can immediately lead to that person feeling very excluded and unclear about whether they're even welcome at the table. So putting something together that's a simple guide to the terminology of this organization is incredibly helpful, as is a strong board orientation that involves board members themselves. Many times organizations rely on staff to orient board members. And as I mentioned earlier, boards themselves are responsible for their own maintaining their membership, identifying a pipeline, bringing new people on, making those people feel welcome, helping those people to get up to speed as quickly as possible. So the board orientation should definitely include existing board members. Any kind of social activities for board members, even if it's quite infrequent, 1 or 2 times a year, is also part of building community. Creating opportunities for board members to volunteer together is very helpful. And it's incredibly valuable for an organization to have a regular way for the board to have extended time that's not constrained by the limits of a traditional board meeting. So typically this would be a board retreat. It could be a half-day meeting. It could be a whole-day meeting. But an opportunity to really pull back from the details that are considered at a, let's say, monthly board meeting and be able to look at the big picture. Similarly, it's important for board members to stay connected to mission, and you can ask what this organization does to help ensure that its board stays connected to mission. Here are some ideas about how that can happen. A regular check-in about important decisions, which takes advantage of the opportunity to pull back and say, how is this decision going to impact our mission? It's important that boards don't assume just because somebody is at the table and says that they care about the organization's mission, not assume that all members have the same interpretation of what that mission is, especially for organizations who have multi-sentence missions or paragraph missions. You may find that people have gravitated and connected to one portion of the mission, which matters extremely important to them, and other parts of the mission less so. So having an opportunity to really pull out the full mission, talk about it, and make sure that everybody has a full understanding of all of the components of it and is engaged with the entire mission is incredibly helpful. And then it's really great if board members are encouraged to get out of the boardroom by attending community meetings, by volunteering, as was mentioned earlier, by visiting program sites, if there's more than one location. This is a way that board members can continue to maintain their touch and connection to mission, which is part of them continuing to feel connected to the organization and helps remind people on a regular basis why they volunteered to come into this boardroom in the first place. So as a board member, your most important contributions are to be prepared and be informed, to ask informed questions, to operate as a volunteer both in and outside the boardroom, to attend events that the organization puts on, to address meeting culture and practice, as we mentioned earlier, where that is not leading to the most productive setting for you and for your fellow board members, to build relationships with your fellow board members, to maintain independent thinking. And as we mentioned earlier, the board is fulfilling its highest and best function when it is providing, acting as a brain trust and not as a rubber stamp, which means maintaining independence and autonomy and avoiding groupthink. So before we conclude this webinar, I want to remind you that we're collecting information from all of the individuals participating in BoardConnect through a survey. The information that we collect is going to be part of how we help to match you with interested nonprofits when we get together next Friday evening. And I'd like to conclude by just asking you to reflect a little bit on any of the ahas you may have had, any oh my's in the sense of something that I heard that maybe I would like to do differently, or perhaps you're leaving with questions, things that I'm not sure about or I'm still thinking about. Well, why don't we pause here and see what kind of feedback you have to what was presented today.
I think the structure, learning what an actual mature board structure is really helpful here.
Great. And is there anything that, because of this,
you're having board buddies and stuff like that?
Yeah. Tia, is there anything that was not covered here because of the nature of the boards you work with that you want to make sure would be part of either next Friday's presentation? There won't be much presentation content at next Friday, but we certainly could provide an overview to everybody so that people understand that organizations are in different stages of development. Is there anything that would be more helpful to you?
No, I definitely have some things that I'm going to go and like Google later and see like how can these apply. These are great ideas that I can do on my own fruition. But I appreciate the prompts to do so.
Okay, wonderful. So these will be mailed out, and the recording has, I mean, the webinar has been recorded. So chances are it will be about 24 hours until we can mail out the presentation with the accompanying recording. I am also going to try to put together a very, very short list of a couple of articles to scan for people that are coming to next week's gathering. And of course, we will be sending out a little bit more information about what the flow of the evening will look like. So look for all of that to be landing in your inbox in the next 1 to 2 days.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the time.
Thank you for coming to today's webinar, and I very much look forward to meeting you in person next week.
All right, thank you.
Take care now. Bye-bye.